I'm talking here to Leo Stutz, Cardston's foremost historian. And Leo, tell us where we are. It's a beautiful day.
This is at Kimball, the Kimball head gates. Now the original head gate was not quite as it is today. That weir over there was where they controlled the flow of the river. The platform we are standing on is where the canal intake was, and they would control the flow of the river by simply a weir. Then in 1929, the CPR, who then owned it, improved it by rebuilding these head gates. So originally it was a weir and a less elaborate intake, but this, looking down here, is the old canal. And it was contracted to the, construction was contracted to the LDS Church in 1898, had to be completed in 2 years. And it was all done by team and slip scraper and Fresno, so you can imagine the amount of work. There were some hundreds of teams at work. They sectionalized it and let the contracts in sections. This particular section with the head gates was contracted to Jesse Smith. C.O. Card himself held the plow to plow the first furrow here on this ditch. The people that worked on the ditch were paid half in land and half in wages, and that established a base for a lot of immigration, because now they had some land here. They didn't go back in many cases, and so this country became settled quite rapidly after the canal project. Little side interesting thing that's interesting to me, while all these teams were at work, there was a large demand for oats, and so a lot of farmers are raising oats. When the canal was suddenly completed, the demand for oats was gone and the market was gone, and to get them into Montana, where there was still a market, they were still doing some work over there on their ditch. They had a problem getting across the line through customs. So they devised a scheme by which the farmers would drive along the boundary line with their gunny sacks full of oats and occasionally throw one over the line and drive on. There was nothing, they were just discarding oats. And then a few days later, a Montana farmer by pre-arrangement would come along and pick the sacks up. And there was quite an export of oats under that system. Another little side bit here. Just down this canal, about a half a mile, there was an old dredging barge that was abandoned, and in the late teens. And during the 20s, when Prohibition and bootlegging was at its full height, Picarella from Blairmore was running whiskey out through Whiskey Gap, and they would get a tip-off over in Blairmore that a load was coming through. They knew that they could travel quite a few roads until they got to Whiskey Gap, and then they had a bottleneck, so the police would be watching for the load there. But they used this old barge as a staging depot, and so the load would leave, but they never found it crossing the line. And they would store it in this old barge, which nobody would suspect was anything but a discard, and probably a week or 10 days later, when the heat had cooled off, another car would approach empty and load up the whiskey, and across the line they got with that. So those were two devices that were used, and quite a bit of interest locally.
Is that part of that barge around anymore, or is it long gone?
Long gone, yeah. It was, I suppose, used for fuel. There was not too much fuel out in this country, you know, and anything that was usable, there was temptation to use it to burn in the wintertime. This was quite a community. It was the largest satellite community from Cardston in the district. 300 population here, and it was quite a boom town because of being the last town when you left to go to the States. This is where the old Blue Trail ran through and went out to the port of entry at Twin Lakes, and the police station was there. So there was quite a lot of traffic here, particularly when they began to develop Glacier Park as a tourist attraction, and the tourists came right through here from all Alberta, and they had to go right through Kimball. There were 3 large stores, dance hall, and church, and large school, 2-story school, and it was really a thriving community. These were not small stores; they were full-fledged country stores that handled everything, you know, from needles on up.
What year are we talking here now? 1920s?
Well, 1898 is when the population influx came here. The post office then was moved from 3.5 miles down the river. It was the St. Mary's post office, and it was then moved up to Kimball, and that was 98, 99. And the community thrived from then until 1927, when the road was built through Carway, and there was no longer any traffic to the States here. The police station was closed, the line was closed up, there was no port of entry, and so that was the period when Kimball was famous. They had a big cheese and butter making plant over on the river here, and it was one of the few bridges, you know, that they could cross the river, so there was some traffic. But a few years ago, this was almost desolate. Now it's building up again because there's still a subdivided community here. The land is subdivided, and as you know, you can't readily get small acreage in Alberta anymore. You have to go for 80 acres to get a subdivision. So it's become a bit popular again, and we have, you'll notice, 6 or so new homes out here.
How did Kimball get its name?
Named after one of the people that were working here on the canal. He, in fact, was an employee of C.O. Card himself, one of the Kimball boys. There were several of the Kimballs here, but they were, the Kimball family was a large family, and it was just named after one of the people that was involved.
There have been Kimballs that have been high up in the church, have there not? Would these be relatives?
Oh yes, they're relatives. Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could just review this again. This is then where the big irrigation started in Alberta, is that right?
The first big irrigation in Canada. Okay. Yeah, this was developed in 1896 when they began to promote it. Mm-hmm. It was promoted very much by the Galt of Lethbridge and the C.A. McGrath. They had large land grants and the AR&I Railroad had a lot of land down here, but they needed population and sale of the land, and they began to realize that they had to get irrigation to do that. Now, in the mid-90s was very dry, but after they started the canal, we got into a wet period, and they were being ridiculed for digging a ditch to supply water instead of drainage ditch to take it away. So we had some very wet years. In fact, the wettest year on record in the Lethbridge district is 1902. Now that's 1902, and we had 2 major floods in Cardston, the most property damage in town of any floods we ever had, although it wasn't as large a flood as we got in 1908 was the biggest flood. 1964 was a big one, but the 1908 was the granddaddy of them all.
Now, what is being done to try to preserve this as an historic site?
Yes, the Historical Society of Cardston and District have applied to have this designated, and it's being very seriously looked at, and I think it'll go through. We had a man here from Historic Sites day before yesterday to inspect the damage that might have been done by the ice jam this spring. Now, old-timers will all agree that that was the greatest test ever put on these head gates. When you think that ice was jammed 12 feet deep against that, when a backup of water against it, and yet there's no visible damage to the head gates at all. So he went away satisfied that they will be here for the foreseeable future with no danger of them being washed down the stream or damaged.
So the key now is to preserve them before they get worse, and I don't imagine the province likes to try to restore things. They want to preserve them while they can, eh?
Well, as this official said, he said this is a project that won't require any expenditure. They will preserve themselves. We will make them a little safer, but so far as preservation is concerned, why, we could see it sitting here for 100 years, whether it's designated or not, without any effort or any expenditure, and that's quite a plus item for the department, that this is something they could preserve without spending money to do it.
I wonder if you could just take us for a minute. We're going to go look at is it the ferry crossing? No, it wouldn't be the ferry crossing. It's the man that looked after the head gates, his home. Is that right?
The AR&I were taken over by the CPR in 1912, and the CPR built this home to provide a house for the man that looked after these head gates.
Let's go have a look at it.
Just before you go, take a look at the mechanism for raising and lowering these enormous gates and the weight that's on them, and it was all his job. His job was to raise and lower them and control the river flow, and he did it all by hand. There was no power. Just take a look at that before we go. They had a good mechanical advantage here with this worm and sector gear, but as that gear turned, it would wrap the cable up, and the cable would raise and lower the gate, and it had this counterweight on so that the full weight of the gate didn't have to be raised. The counterweight helped lift it. So it was a balanced effect. And the caretaker had to continually be on his patrol here to keep the water level right, so that the water level would control the flow at those gates to the canal. Now he had a similar problem there because he had to control the amount of water going down that ditch. You can understand if we had flood conditions, you got a little bit too much water down there, it could do a lot of damage. On the other hand, if he got too little, there'd be some complaints. So
if I can get this story straight, the water is going to go down that ditch over there, right?
Right.
And this is basically just to control the water level so that you've got enough water to go down that ditch.
That's correct.
By golly, I think I've got it.
Very good.
So this is basically a continuation of the river. By the way, did we say what river it was?
This is the St. Mary's River.
Okay.
It rises in Montana. Have you time for a little story in connection with this?
Yep.
Okay, when they got this project completed, the Montana people, eastern Montana, wanted the water from the St. Mary's River, and there was nothing to prevent them taking it. It rises in the states, and the states simply said, we're going to divert the river. You didn't get our permission to build this canal, and we wouldn't have given it had you done so, because we need that in eastern Montana. So they proceeded to do a survey. First, the Canadian government paid no attention. They surveyed it and proved that they could do it. Then they began to get excited, and so they were really serious. They were ready to go to work and take all the St. Mary's River down to eastern Montana. But the Canadian government had a trump card. They were already using the Milk River in Montana, which circles into Canada and back, and so the Canadian government said, if you take that St. Mary's River, we will take the Milk River. You won't gain anything. We'll take the Milk River because it's coming into Canada and you can't stop that. So then there was a bit of a showdown, and the upshot of it all was that the United States wouldn't back down at the time, so they let a contract for 14 miles of ditch to divert the Milk River into Alberta. And it was let to H.S. Allen and a man by the name of Kazare in Cardston, and they dug the ditch. It went that far down the road. Then the United States government began to take notice, and there was a meeting at the very top level between Washington and Ottawa, and as a result of that showdown, the Water Commission, the International Water Commission, was established about 1910, and they agreed on a certain portion of the river to go to the states, and they take it out over at the dam in Swift Current, a small stream there that they do divert under terms of that treaty. But it was almost a showdown. I suppose in some cases it caused a war, but it didn't in this case. They finally negotiated and got it settled.
And that ditch that they built is down near Milk River, isn't it?
Yes.
The ditch you're talking about.
The ditch we're talking about.
So
now they're reviving that Milk River irrigation to a point now, you know. Apparently they agreed at that time that there should be a certain portion of the river for each party, and so Canada didn't take it. They weren't interested at the time, but right now there's some new interest in Milk River water.
Yeah. I remember being down in near the town of Milk River on the Snow Ranch. And they showed this ditch, which is called Spite Ditch, I believe, in some books, done to spite the other guys.
Spite Ditch, that well named.
And anyway, tourists can go there and have a look at it if you know where to look, I guess. Eh?
This gate is not much different in level than the main head gate to the canal, so they could still control it.
Now this whole ditch here. This is the actual irrigation ditch. Now it's full of trees, right?
Yes, right.
Let's see. And those trees have grown up in about how many years then?
Well, they've had since 1954 that the ditch was practically abandoned about then in favor of the St. Mary's project at Spring Coulee, although some water was used then for the next 10 years for cattlemen down the stream. But 1964 did away with all that possibility by washouts in the canal, and it hasn't been used since.
Well, you were telling us a little earlier that this was an area where you thought Cardston possibly could have been.
Yes, for a number of reasons. First of all, it was selected for the first roadhouse, the first police detachment, and it was on the old Upper Fort Benton Trail, which had followed the Blackfoot Trail, the old Travoy Trail, and the Indians had certainly found it a popular spot to camp. And if you look up and down the river here, it's a beautifully laid out section because it's just high enough to escape the floods and low enough to be easily irrigated. So that's looking at the whole picture. It was selected by the Indians, selected by the police, selected by the first white people to settle. And 3 years after the Mormons came to Cardston, President Woodruff of the church looked at it and thought it was such an ideal place. He told President Card of this district, buy that and establish a second town in the Mormon settlement on that flat. He was very impressed with it. He was out here catching fish and had pretty good luck. Maybe that he was biased on that account, but he was certainly impressed with this area. Another thing that made it quite prominent was the Coldest School. Maybe Mrs. Bowlby's told you about that, but the Coldest School was established here and became one of the first registered districts. In 1897, the Coldest School District was registered, and that school served until 1902, when it was moved over to Kimball and served there as the Kimball Schoolhouse until 1905, when Mr. Bennett bought it and turned it into a blacksmith shop. And it was there until a few years ago. Do you know, Mrs. Bowlby, is it still there?
No, I don't know. I don't know.
We will have a look today and see if it is still there, but it was there until very recently, the old Coldest Schoolhouse. Of course, this was the Coldest post office too. There was a post office here, and some people call it Coles, some Coldest. Coles, who was established here first in the early 80s, was a remittance man. I think everyone will know what remittance men were if they know anything about history at all. They were the kids from usually rich families that sent them out here and sent them a remittance periodically to keep them going, to stay away. Yeah, it was stay away from England. But anyway, he was one of the remittance men. We had quite a few of them around the Cardston district. There was Fred Pace over at Standoff, and Bright, who established the Bright Ranch up in Stedden district. There were quite a number of remittance men, but Coldest was one of the best known ones. And so this was quite an important center. It was 3 miles down the river from Kimball, and of course when the Kimball Dam was, the head gates were constructed and the irrigation ditch, which is just up above us here on the hill, the construction crew came there and established that as the center, and that's ultimately became the important community center, the largest one outside of Cardston, by the way, with over 300 people there in the early part of the century. And it flourished and boomed until 1927, when the old Blue Trail route to the States was abandoned in favor of the route through Carway. Carway route was shorter. And incidentally, the old whiskey trail went through there too, and many a whiskey trader and many a story in connection with the whiskey trade in the Prohibition days in the early 20s.
So you look ahead, and then we'll look back, because we're going to go back to 1887, and the Mormons would have come over the top of the hill there. You can see the color change where the trail still is today as they came down the ravine. And then it came across the lot that we're standing on now and swung over to the river. So we'll just take a turn now. Now, looking at the double T anchor logo on the barn there, just to the left in front of the Quonset hut is where the stopping house was, and that was there when the Mormons arrived. And then farther out in the field, towards the cliff in the distance, is where the St. Mary's detachment was. The mounted police were here, and at that particular point, they went across the river to the site of where Cardston is today. Okay, we're on St. Mary's River at Kimball Park, near Cardston. I'm just talking to Mr. Stutz, who has mentioned to us that across the river you can see the travois tracks that still exist. A very rare sight indeed. Unfortunately, his eyesight is not good enough to pinpoint them for us. So what we're going to have to do is simply look at the hillside and you be the judge as to where you think they are. There are three possibilities as we see it right now. Over to my left, you can see a trail that is sort of going up the hill at an angle, almost looks like a roadway. Possibly that would be it. Then as you move along, you can see what looks most like travois tracks. These are the two sticks that the Indians pull behind their horses, two poles. The ones in the center seem the most obvious as that type of a track, but yet it doesn't seem like the proper terrain that they would be normally going up. The other alternative is maybe a little bit to our right, where you can see a little bit of a hollow and a different coloration in the grass, and the steepness would not be as much. And maybe that's what he was referring to. I think it points out the fact that people that know these things, if they could bring it to our attention, you know, so that we can record these as early as possible before we end up in a situation where we're not 100% sure, as in this case. So looking at the three trails that are possible, I guess you, the viewer, are going to have to take your pick.
Yeah, this is the only identifiable travois trail, three-horse trail of the horse days when the travois was well marked. They had dog travois before that, but none of them know. But this was a horse travois trail, and the only one we know of, and it goes up the face of one of these hills. So we don't think this trail was ever used as a wagon road because it's not practical. Now Rosie Davis, at the age of about 108, died several years ago, and she told me about riding the travois down that trail, and told me exactly where it was. And the largest Indian encampment, that is collection of Indian teepee rings we know of in this country, was just about a third of a mile southeast of where we were standing. And Jack Dunn, who donated this land for a park, told me that there were 50 well-identified teepee rings there up until 1927, when they used it as a gravel pit to get gravel to build the Carway Road. Prior to that, of course, the old Blue Trail went right through here, and we just left it a few minutes ago. They went up through Kimball, but that was abandoned in 1927. They took the teepee rings out with the gravel. So we have no teepee rings to show right now. But this is quite a historic spot because that says so, and the old travois trail says so, and can still be identified on the face of a hill opposite where we're standing on the. Rosie Davis told me it would be to the right, up the face of one of those hills. Perhaps when we go back on the road we can look across and see it. At some times of the year these trails are much more easily seen than right now when everything's a neutral brown. But in the spring, when the grass comes up a little faster in the depressions or the snow drifts, you can see it more plainly. But I think that it's the second or third hill over from the one we're looking at. Now we are standing where the Immigration Gap road from Cardston to Montana terminates at the boundary line. We're facing west at the moment and looking toward the monument to the Cardston Mormon pioneers. It's where they crossed during the month of May and up to the 3rd of June in 1887. The first wagon across was A.L. Allen, who came in with his wagon to Cardston on the 2nd of May. Then the Thomas Rowell Levitt, the Johannes Anderson families, and one or two others came in during the month of May. And on the 3rd of June, Card arrived at Cardston. They crossed the line here, of course, the day before, and went to the river, but couldn't cross the river that night, so they built a boat, and the next morning the river had gone down sufficiently to ford it, and they didn't need the boat. But this is the point they crossed the line. When the Card and Wolf families crossed, the last of the group that were coming, which took in, as I think I mentioned, 41 souls altogether, with counting the wives and children, they, Mr. Card came ahead and threw his hat in the air and hollered, "Hooray for Canada." He had crossed the line and was safely on Canadian soil, and had now considered they had made the journey safely. They only had another 15 miles to go, and they were at the site that he had designated before he'd gone to meet his wife and family. Zina was the wife coming with him. He had gone to meet them at Helen and then came back with his wagons. But prior to that, he had plowed the first furrow at Cardston and then had gone south to meet his wagons. So while he was at Cardston, his wagons didn't arrive until the last of the group. The monument that's built there is a rock monument with a plaque. It's badly deteriorated, but the Historical Society have recently discussed the matter and are hoping to get it restored for our town's centennial celebration in 1987, next year. It does need some repairs, and Bruce Haig is over there inspecting it right now, and I asked him to give us an estimate on what it would cost to repair it. We are going to certainly put it back in shape for the centennial. We are now looking south at Immigrant Immigration Gap, where the Cardston pioneers came through. Now, of course, it had been used a lot before the Cardston pioneers came. It's safe to assume that cattle drives had come through here, and before that whiskey traders, and before that of course it had been used for a long time as the North Blackfoot Trail, one of the branches. There were 3 main routes through this height of land. The water on the other side of the Hudson Bay and Milk River Ridge flow, of course, into the Missouri River. The waters on this side, of course, go into the Hudson Bay. And so it's called the Hudson Bay Divide up in Glacier Park, and the Milk River Ridge where we are now. And these 3 gaps, this is the center one. The Whiskey Gap is east of us, and the Halls Coulee Gap is west of us. And the traffic in those days was through one of those 3 gaps. They were the only really practical route to take a